All right, welcome back from our break. We're so glad that you're sticking with us. Now is the time where we're going to look at question and answer. Up until this point, you've been hearing their prepared presentations, and now you'll have an opportunity to ask some questions with regards to the presentations. And by the way, up until now, each of your presentations have been insightful, helpful, encouraging. Thank you. We know that in this day and age, it takes a lot of courage, and there's a certain level of risk that you take to be willing to go against the popular narrative, but we appreciate it. We appreciate both of you, and we just want to say thank you. We're praying for you, and we really appreciate your courage in coming to Stone Tower and sharing this. Okay, so how this question and answer time will work is we have an orange microphone in the center aisle. If you have a question, we just ask that you would go to the orange microphone there. I'm going to serve as the moderator. What sort of questions can you ask? Well, we would prefer questions that relate to the topics that have been discussed here. If there's a question that maybe veers off topic, I'll leave it up to Jonathan and Dr. Song if you would like to answer that question. So I'll leave that up to you. Obviously, personal questions like, what did you have for lunch? Probably not appropriate, but general questions such as, can you explain more about some of the data that you showed, or can you explain more about what you said about the history of religious liberty? Those would be appropriate questions. So let's go ahead and start with a prayer, and then we can go ahead and have individuals step up to the microphone. And if you could please state who your question is for, that would be helpful. And yes, we'll go that way. So let's bow our heads for prayer, shall we? Gracious Heavenly Father, we want to thank you so much for giving each one of us brains to think and bodies to keep in harmony for you and in good health for you. I pray, Lord, that you would lead this question and answer time. Please be with us, be with our moderators, be with those who are sharing answers and asking questions. And we ask this all in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay. Let's go ahead and start with our first question. Who would like to come? Frank. It says on air. So we're planning on live streaming the question and answer time. You're welcome. But you won't be on camera, if that relieves you. It's just up here that's on camera. All right. Yeah, if you could just raise your hand, I can choose you, and then you can go ahead and go back to the microphone. And we have somebody at the microphone just now. Who is your question directed to?
So it could be to either one or both. In the application thereof, because of this. There's been a couple people that have come to me this week and said, I don't see how this vaccination issue is related to religious liberty. I know that's been the weekend focus. For somebody that expresses that type of point of view, is there any short connecting answer that you could explain how this vaccine mandate is connected to religious liberty? Would be the question.
I could start with that. First off, I would tell them that that's kind of unique. The government has recognized for years that this is a religious liberty question, and if you go to the EEOC, that's the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, to their website, and they talk specifically about the requirement for employers to recognize religious objections to vaccination and to give exemptions. So that's one thing. The government does recognize these as such. And then the second one, which is a point I was trying to make, is that our bodies are the temple of God. And as such, especially as Adventists, we have specific beliefs about and teachings about things like tobacco, alcohol, and diet and health. And we have a fundamental belief, number 22, that says that we believe fundamentally, this is one of our cardinal church documents, that we are to treat our bodies intelligently. And then finally is that if your body is sick, it's not going to do nearly as good a job worshiping God as if your body is not sick. And so your health is absolutely critical. We can go right down the list. What did Jesus do when he was here? He healed people. So Jesus cares about your health. And then you have the apostles. John in his letter says, hey, I wish above all things, just as your spiritual health is good, may your physical health be good. So I think it's certainly a spiritual issue.
All right. Thank you, Jonathan. Are there any other questions? While we're waiting, yeah, Carm. And feel free to line up at the mic if you'd like. While we're waiting for her to get to the microphone, may I ask a question?
Sure.
This one is to Dr. Song. I've been hearing some great concern about the drug remdesivir. Could you speak to that? I know that seems to be, at this time, if you get COVID, you go into the hospital, standard practice is to prescribe that. And if someone is prescribed that particular drug, is there any cause for worry? And a follow-up question to that would be, does a patient have a right, if they go to the hospital, to reject such drug?
I'll address the second question first, that you do absolutely have a right to reject any treatment that's being offered to you. If you're out of it, you may not know what's being given to you, so that's the danger there. But if you're coherent and you're following things and you're well enough to do so, you can absolutely reject. I do practice in the outpatient setting solely at this time, so I don't have direct experience with remdesivir. I know there were problems with that drug in studies, and I can't speak further on specifics with regard to remdesivir and associated effects.
Okay, thank you.
I'll say something, though. Never take medical advice from a lawyer, but as a lawyer, we do kind of watch these kinds of things because maybe there'll be a lawsuit coming. Remdesivir seems to have pretty negative effects upon kidneys, and I think we're definitely seeing some kidney disease come out of this, and we'll see what the long term is.
Thank you. Okay, first person at the mic.
My question is about ivermectin, and with it being so limited, what is the best way for us to have access to it?
I was for a while prescribing it for, on the pretext of, well, you're in a high-risk job and you could take it prophylactically. Not that I necessarily wanted people to do that. Some people wanted to have some on hand. I have stopped doing that because it's been difficult to get the drug even for people who are ill and needing it desperately. I don't have any great ideas. I think right now I'm trying to move more towards using other treatments. There is the monoclonal antibody treatment that's available that's actually quite effective. It's just a little bit more difficult to, you have to get yourself over there, and like I said earlier, there are usually criteria that you have to meet to get it, and not everyone would qualify. Also, some people may have problems with the way the drug was developed. So I've been trying to really focus a lot on early treatment with hydrotherapy. It can be very effective if you do it properly. And other simple remedies like using onion poultices. I myself had a lot of skepticism about that at first until I saw with my own eyes what was happening with family members that I was doing it on, and other friends in the community who had COVID. So I'm trying to move away from that. I could talk to you later privately some more, but it's been difficult. I have been working with small independent pharmacies that are more likely to dispense. If you're wanting to know about having it on hand, I don't know of a good way that I could just tell you to do that. And I do not actually recommend taking it prophylactically, meaning, just taking it once a week just to keep from getting COVID. I personally don't recommend that. I'm not saying that there isn't evidence for it. There is actually evidence for some efficacy of ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine as a preventive, but I don't currently recommend that people do that.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
This question is for Jonathan Zirkle. So I wanted to get your opinion on proof of vaccination and the forced, like if you don't produce it for your employment or for like a conference or something like that, that you have to get and show a COVID test. And the reason why I'm asking is I had a conference coming up next week, and they said that you couldn't come to the conference unless you showed proof of vaccination or took a COVID test. And I let them know that for religious reasons, I'm not going to do any of it. I don't take vaccinations, and I'm not going to take any invasive medical procedures. And then I was told that I couldn't come to the conference, and then I told them that was discrimination. And then I think after a week, the conference was moved to virtual. But then I still got an email saying that the next conference in March, kind of a threatening email that that's going to all be required. So obviously it's not over. So I just wanted to get your opinion on the legalities of that, and then what, because I'm sure the people here have had similar issues on their jobs as to what, you can do about things like that.
Yeah, so the biggest problem comes when you have to be vaccinated with no testing as an option. Usually when there's a vaccination requirement but the testing is an option, right now those aren't battles that I'm willing to fight. There's so many people that are getting stuck having to take the vaccine that's what I'm really focused in on. And now the testing is definitely an issue, because if you get tested too often, too invasively, or things like that, there's definitely some real concerns there. But the situation you're describing, I don't see any real big legal concern there. Now, having said that, there was a dentist that I worked with, and she was getting her exemption, and she talked to me about the testing. She had a real problem. She had gone overseas during the pandemic, and she had to test to come back to the United States, and they did the probe up her nose and everything like that. She got a bloody nose that lasted 2 weeks. And so she's all like, I'm not going to do this again. So for her, we were able to convince her employer that she really did need the saliva test. So I think a lot of it has to go with just how invasive the test is. And I say this just generally for everyone here that's got these kinds of testing questions. They're starting to become home tests, and I highly recommend that you get those kinds of tests. And then I think it's up to you to determine how invasive you intend to administer that test on yourself. And the other thing is that these tests are not very accurate. There's another problem that we're going to be addressing, I think, sooner rather than later, is the idea that the vaccinated are just as much or more a reservoir for the virus, so why aren't we testing them?
Right.
And I think when that starts to become more of an issue, then we'll start to see some of the lawyers actually taking up the issue about getting rid of testing for the unvaccinated.
Thank you.
I think that's a really important point right there. And with UCSD looking at the data that the majority of their infections are among the vaccinated, their policy is to test by trigger, questionnaire trigger. It's a daily screening that all employees have to go through, and also contact triggers rather than by vaccine status. Now, they may have changed their practice just in recent weeks because of the president's announcement and the state of California's announcement, but if they do test their healthcare their unvaccinated workers weekly or biweekly, I know that they're still doing this other testing as well, irregardless of vaccine status. But I think it makes more sense to treat vaccinated workers the same as unvaccinated, because there are many settings where when you have that high of a percentage of people vaccinated, as in certain healthcare systems, that the majority now will be vaccinated who come down with COVID.
My question was similar to hers, but I was going to ask you, Dr. Song, if you could explain more or elaborate more on, is it really feasible to do a weekly test? Because my employer is planning on asking those who do not get vaccinated or whose exemptions are granted to submit to weekly testing.
I'm facing this issue myself, so I can just share with you what I've kind of processed through. I personally don't want to put my employer in a difficult position with the state. So I'm willing to, personally, although I don't think it's right, I'm willing to go along to a certain extent if it doesn't pose any medical risk to me. See, I don't want to be punished financially or health-wise because I chose to file a religious exemption. So because of my religious beliefs, I don't want to be treated in a way that would penalize me. I think the governor of California, anyway, made it clear why he was coming down with this mandate. He didn't cite any literature evidence that testing asymptomatic people reduces the spread of disease in the workplace. He said that this was to encourage more vaccinations. So it's a coercive, or even perhaps you could argue a coercive / punitive instrument. However, I think right now where I stand on this is that I'm willing to test if it's not going to pose a threat to me and not going to result in lost revenue for me, because one of the things to consider is that some places have limited availability of staff that they're willing to commit to testing. So if someone's going to be designated to test you, you may have to drive out of your way to the testing site, for instance. And so that could take time away from, and in my work where I'm paid based on, how many procedures I do, how many patients I see, so forth, it's kind of unfair. The other thing is, as Mr. Zirkle mentioned, there is a rare risk of trauma from the deeper biopsies. It's something like 6 out of 500,000 or so. It's rare, but it is a real risk of severe nosebleed. So I think that while one test to, say, travel internationally, or because somebody in your hall was diagnosed with COVID and they want to, test all contacts, that's reasonable. That's not going to happen very often, But we're talking about 104 tests a year or 52 tests a year. This is repeated, in my opinion, usually unnecessary from a medical and scientific standpoint. These are not, I'm not aware of any data that doing this to asymptomatic people reduce the spread of disease. So I think from a scientific perspective, the evidence is not there. So I would draw the line personally at something that, you know, the deeper swabs, maybe, you know, they're going to be a bit riskier. You can do a cheek swab. There's a saliva test. There are large medical groups in California that are doing a saliva test, and most of the large medical entities around me are allowing home testing. So, you know, you can decide how you do your home test, or self-test, I should say, not necessarily home test, but self-test.
Thank you. Thank you both for coming and being here. Very informative and insightful. Thank you very much.
Okay, you stated that the young boys are getting myocarditis when they get the vaccination. Are you also seeing myocarditis in the elderly people that get vaccinated as well? And are you also seeing, because of the fear factor of the COVID-19, are you seeing more people coming with anxiety who cannot breathe versus people that actually have COVID, and they're not counting the statistics of those people that are coming in with anxiety versus old people that are coming in with COVID?
I think that the PCR test, you know what, I mean, there's always going to be false positives and false negatives. I've seen in my practice that the people that I suspect have COVID, just based on their stories, their clinical picture, usually do end up testing positive. And the people that I see that really sound like this isn't COVID, they've got some respiratory symptoms, but I'm pretty sure it doesn't sound like COVID. Sure enough, they do test negative. So I've seen, just informally, this is anecdotal, but just in my practice, I've seen pretty good correlation between, you know, my own, what I observe as a pretest probability that this is COVID, and the test result that, you know, does turn out to be positive. I'm sorry, the first part of your question was, myocarditis?
Yes, and the elderly who get
So
vaccinated, yes.
my patient population is largely senior. I do see younger adults as well. I don't see kids in the 12 to 17 year age group. From looking at the CDC's data, it looks like the risk is highest for some reason for young myocardial fibers, young hearts. I don't know why that is. I have not seen myocarditis per se in my practice. I have seen 2 cases of pericarditis. So they had elevated markers and clinical picture consistent with pericarditis, but did not have evidence of actual impairment of cardiac function with the myocarditis. So I have seen a lot of other varying degrees of vaccine-related injury, but not really the myocarditis in my patient population.
And so I also asked you about the anxiety, the people that were going into the hospitals for anxiety who could not breathe, because supposedly this COVID is supposed to have like respiratory issues in the body. So how many people are actually going into the hospital with anxiety versus COVID? And they're saying that they got COVID because they got upper respiratory problems, like breathing, you know?
I can't speak to that. I mean, I'm probably going to trust the test result. If it, again, false positives are probable. If the clinical picture doesn't look like COVID, then the test result is less likely to be accurate. It's
so
just
you don't
the way.
think statistics is flawed?
I mean, if you're wondering how many people who don't have COVID but who are anxious about it are being falsely diagnosed with COVID, is that
Yes,
what you're asking?
yes. Mm-hmm.
I would imagine very few. I don't have any numbers on that.
Okay, thank you.
Dr. Song, Mr. Zirkle, thank you very much for being here. It's been a blessing. Natural immunity was mentioned a little while ago. What I wanted to know was, in spite of all the data that's coming out of Israel that's showing that it's around 6 to 13 times better than vaccinations, why is there such a suppression and some sort of an agenda, it seems like, against people with natural immunity?
I appreciate you mentioning that Israel study. It was the one I left out. I meant to include it, actually. I think I had a screenshot of it, and then I just ended up not forgetting to put it into my slides. But yes, there is evidence from Israel that people who've had 2 doses of the vaccine but who have not had COVID are 13 times more likely to get a diagnosis of COVID compared with people who come down with COVID but have not had the vaccine. And in fact, they're 27 times more likely to get symptomatic COVID compared with people who've had natural illness and have not gotten the vaccine. So that's pretty impressive. I know there have been some legal cases. I read about a professor that won a case for he didn't want to get vaccinated because he had proof of natural immunity. I think that's, again, so much about this pandemic just doesn't make sense, doesn't make scientific sense. The answer to that may be more involved than what I can weigh in on from a medical perspective. I don't see a good reason, an excellent reason to do this, especially since there is also some data that people who've had COVID who then get the vaccine on top of that are more likely to get an adverse reaction. So do you have any thoughts?
You're asking the why question.
Of course.
And when you ask why, then we end up leading into speculation.
I know.
And what I think is that why do the textbooks all say for every other disease that natural immunity is a great thing? But yet this disease, we don't think so. Show me some data, and yet the data isn't there. And so then this brings you to another question that I think is a valid one for us to ask. We get taught like, oh, well, that's not a very scientific question, or whatever, But here's the question. It's like, I feel like they want us to get the vaccine. They're a little too eager for us to get the vaccine. And it reminds me of kind of like a girlfriend or someone that wants to be your girlfriend that's a little too eager to go out with you. You're like, maybe not, And so I think that this is something that certainly should raise our suspicion, but there are such things as secrets in life, and I don't know that we have the answer to that question.
So a follow-up to that, I know I'm kind of bordering probably a little bit on conspiracy theory here, but is there any truth to the idea that the new drug that's being developed by Pfizer, or what they call Ivermectin, is similar to the mechanisms of what Ivermectin does with the COVID virus?
Are you talking about the molnupiravir, the Merck drug?
No, there's
No.
a new Pfizer drug that's being tested,
Yes.
and it's going to get an EUA, and people are out there saying that it's very similar to the mechanism of action that Ivermectin had on this virus. And so
Which makes me wonder why not just use the cheap drug Ivermectin.
Exactly.
Well, I think I know.
So.
Well, anyway, I just knew that Pfizer and Roche were both had oral drugs coming down the pike, and I understood that they were similar to the Merck medication. I don't know beyond that because I haven't looked at it, and I'm sorry I can't answer more with that question.
I had a question this evening, might pertain to both of you. I do work in the field of medicine, and I'm concerned because I do feel like this could lead to the destruction of any trust that the public has in medicine, what's going on right now. In Oregon, I think many of us are faced with filling out either the medical or the religious exemption. Virtually, it seems almost impossible at this point as the months have kind of gone by when you look at the vaccines and the contraindications that are listed. It's almost it literally looks almost impossible for anybody to get a medical exemption. Even if you've had severe bleeding incidences, they say you have to wait for 90 days in certain, platelet incidences. So you kind of seen over the last months how they're kind of closing it down where it's going to be hard, it seems. It appears to get a medical exemption. So the other piece of it, and my question is around the religious exemption. As people are deciding and praying about filling out this form, how much should you actually put on that form? Because I think the form has you make a statement about your conviction or whatever it is, why you want the exemption. I do see that this is somewhat of it seems like it's a breach of, I just wonder how, once this is on paper, once you put something on paper, how do you know where this paper goes? How is it protected? Will this be a piece of information that can be used against you or family members or other people that you associate within your group that you affiliate if you put too much information on there? So I guess my question would be, should we be, as we're filling out religious exemptions, should we be concerned about putting too much information, and what should we put, and can this be used against us later?
So I'll say this, as far as I know, there's no protections for those forms. Once you fill it out, they can pretty much share those. It'd be an interesting idea if someone has a damages because of that, if we could sue them over that. As far as what to put on the form, I would really, especially when you're talking about these forms, most of them are done electronically. I would highly recommend that you go to our webpage, libertyandhealth.org, and there's a blog post that I wrote there called Dealing with Larger Employers and Schools or something like that, and it explains how to do these forms. Now, it's interesting that you would ask the question about too much or too little. I am watching carefully what's going on, and I'm kicking around in my head as to what advice to give people. This is what I've observed. I've observed that it seems to me that what you put on the form isn't that important, but what really matters is who's your employer and whether your employer is prone to give these exemptions or not. Now, the other thing, though, that I've also seen is that for the employer that's not prone to give them, nothing's going to move them. But I am watching them squirm. And I'm watching them squirm by the responses they give and the things that they say and do. And I am thinking about revising my advice to people, and I haven't thought about this enough to know one way or another, to actually tell them to put a very terse answer, a smaller answer, rather than a big answer. And part of the reason why I'm thinking that this may be good is that the law requires for you to let your employer know that you have a religious objection. But it's up to the employer to ask you more questions to determine what the boundaries of that are. And if you were listening, normally they're not even supposed to get into it with you on this. If you say less, that's enough to notify them of this. It also gives them less area for them to argue with you. But I don't really see that making a difference because it seems to be just what kind of an employer you have. Now, there's something I wanted to say, and I really wanted to put this into one of my presentations, but it wasn't what I was presenting about. But this is my observation that I want to make. I think right now is a really good time for you to look at your employers and say, who am I working for and what kind of people are these? An employer I think of the employment relationship as being an awful lot like a dating relationship or a marriage. And you end up spending as much time at work as you do in a marriage nearly. I mean, it's a big part of your time, especially if you only count waking hours. You know, if you date somebody who maybe has a little alcohol problem, maybe a little problem with the courts, maybe involved in a lot of lawsuits, you got these little warning signs that maybe they're not the people for you. And I think that we do need to look at our employers, and you can see how your employers are treating you, and maybe they're not the employer for you. And maybe we can look also at the way the employers are handling these exemptions as kind of a little warning sign that maybe it's not even worth the fight. And even if you had to fight and got what you wanted, maybe you still want to think that you want to look somewhere else. And I also feel that way about the employers that are playing a game of chicken with you. They like to see, okay, who's going to cave first? Are you going to take the vaccine, or are you going to get fired? That's what they say, right? But you're also looking to see, do you really have a nerve to fire me when you're going to fire all my coworkers too, or a bunch of my coworkers, and you can't staff this place anymore? So all this is going on, and I think this is a great time for everyone to take a really big, deep breath, relax, and decide where they're going in life and who they really want to work for and what they want to do.
Thanks for being here. I have a few questions on my waiver from my employer. It's asking me to identify my creed or religious belief, and then it's also asking me if I've had previous vaccinations since the age of 21, and to describe in detail the religious practices of why we don't believe, or why we'd be against it. And I'm wondering how our denomination stands against that, how I should answer that, because I don't know if it's...
Sure. So that's a lot of questions here. I'm going to try to remember them all. But I'll start with the one that bugs me a lot, because when they ask the question, have you ever had any other vaccines? They're assuming they understand your objection to vaccines. Because they're making an assumption that you are saying, I have an objection to all vaccines. But they're not listening, because, like, for me, I've had a lot of vaccines, and, I probably have another one. But I won't take a COVID vaccine, because the COVID vaccine is dangerous, and it's bad for my body, which is the temple of God. And that's what you're saying. But if they would listen, but it's almost like they absolutely refuse to listen. And then when you answer that question, they're like, see, that's not a religious belief. We're going to have to take that to court. Now, I know you asked some other questions. What's the position of the denomination? Well, there's not a whole lot out there that would meet the definition of position. I call it a stance, perhaps. But the denomination, the Seventh-day Adventist denomination's got a process whereby it develops fundamental beliefs. Well, there's no mention of vaccines and fundamental beliefs, but you can Google and go to the website and you can see their stance. The latest one, I think, was adopted in 2015. It was done at I believe they call it an AdCom meeting, which is just, my understanding, it's just kind of like all the GC vice presidents got together and voted this, and then it gets published on the webpage. That isn't normally how we would develop something that's actually a doctrine, but yet your employer will read that, and your employer may write back to you and say, well, see, it says right here, there's nothing in your doctrine that would prevent you from being immunized. But that's not really true, because if you look at the fundamental beliefs, there's fundamental belief number 22, which says you'll care for your body as the temple of God, and you'll do so intelligently. And there's other doctrinal statements that say we support liberty of conscience. So in the Adventist church, there is no magisterium. So you should be able to have the full support of your church in this. And there are some of us that are working on communicating with the church to try to help explain this and also explain the problems. This is actually, there's now starting to be some court cases that are coming down, and the court system the United States is divided up into regions, and it's by the federal circuit courts. And the Third Circuit, which is in Pennsylvania, I think it's New York and everything like that, we're starting to see district court cases come out where the district court is talking about the denominational beliefs that these people are involved with, and they just use it as one factor to see whether or not it's a legitimate belief. If we could have a church that says part of their beliefs is that this immunization may be prohibited, maybe, it doesn't have to say must, it would change the district court analysis. So I think that we should be, we're all members, and the beliefs of the church emanate from the members, and we need to be talking to our conference officials, people further up the food chain, and really asking them. And it's going to be uncomfortable. And the sad thing is that this is a crazy polarization time we're in. So I don't know how it's going to work.
Well, one last question on that then. Should I, on the vaccine question, I could simply answer I haven't taken an mRNA vaccine. Maybe go from there. Because it's not your typical vaccine.
I agree. It's very different and far more invasive than other vaccines have been, and it works in a fundamentally different way.
Right.
I mean, you could make that argument. I mean, they call it a vaccine, but it is genetic material that will program your cells to do certain things that I'm not aware of other vaccines working that way. So
Except for the rabies one, I think.
Can I say one thing, though, to that? Is that there is a traditional vaccine coming down the pipe, and you may not want that vaccine either. Here's the bottom line. 9 out of 10 vaccines, when they go through the testing process at the FDA, fail. They fail on either safety or efficacy. We got another vaccine that's coming through on a high-speed track. There's a study from, I think it was 2017, so before this, and basically, it wasn't even really a study, it was a paper, and the paper was basically explaining why we should never have a coronavirus vaccine at all. And the reason why they said that was they said because the proteins in coronaviruses are so similar to the ones in our body that you're going to create an autoimmune response, and these people have autoimmune disease. So just because the next vaccine is not an mRNA vaccine, don't kid yourself, we don't have anything to prove that it's safer than the ones we have. Plus, it's probably going to be full of spike protein, and even though your body won't be producing it, the spike protein is the toxin. I don't care what the vaccine is. If it hasn't gone through 5 to 10 years of actual study, the answer is no.
Well, on that one last statement, I guess in the news they came out with the FDA approval that the Pfizer vaccine wasn't technically approved. That was on the news today. It was under a different name. Their biotech or whatever the other company is the one that's approved, and it's coming out later.
So Jonathan, you may be able to speak to that better than I can. The Comirnaty is supposed to be the new name that the Pfizer vaccine was baptized with. But in fact, it may just be a cover name for a drug that doesn't exist?
I can explain it. It's an amazing thing, and FDA is being sued right now, hopefully fast enough to matter. And this is who it matters to the most, is our military, okay? Because of the rules on EUAs. But this is what they did. They said, hey, we are going to approve this vaccine, Comirnaty, and it's got the same formula, it's the same drug as Pfizer-BioNTech or whatever it is. And they said, hey, it's the same formula, everything's cool, one's approved, but then you go read the footnote. They put it in the footnote, and they say, although the formula is the same, that the Comirnaty is a legally distinct product from the Pfizer one, and that the Pfizer one will be continued to be marketed under the EUA. And in the United States, you can't get Comirnaty. They're not selling it here. So there is no approved drug available on the market today. And this is the biggest sophistry. I don't know what kind of game they're playing, but it really matters for our men in uniform because they have different rights if something is under an EUA or not.
I'll let her go and I'll ask
I have a
another
question, Jonathan, about that. Is there a different indemnity for the approved versus the authorized drug? Are they under a legal shield that you would not get if they're...
That's a very interesting question because she's saying, is there a lawsuit reason, a liability reason for this? And the answer is there could be yes, although I'm a little bit suspicious that that's not really at the bottom because just vaccines in general already have a lot of protections. And so it's true that they will have more liability, but I haven't been convinced yet that it's going to be like tremendous more. But maybe it is because we're seeing so many injuries. So it could be large. It could be the liability issue.
I just wanted to kind of clarify something about the community. So I'm a nurse at one of the hospitals that's been put on unpaid leave because I wouldn't take the shot. And I personally have seen people being given the community on their Mars. So I saw 2 patients last week being given the community right
So
here.
you've seen it marketed with the label on it?
I haven't seen the actual vial, but when I look at the MAR, it was shown they were given a dose of community
Interesting.
on the
So-
MAR. So either they're lying and they're just giving them the Pfizer and calling it community, or they actually have community at the hospital.
Interesting. Well, that'll be new, because I hadn't heard that it was available yet.
So I was kind of shocked when I saw it too, because that day I was looking at the MARs for some patients, and there were 2 that had been given the community.
Okay, good to know.
So it's around here somewhere. I can't verify because I didn't actually see the vials with the labels on them, but I did see it on the MARs. So I think they have limited supplies here in the area. And also large medical facilities around here are denying religious exemptions, just kind of flat out. They don't bother to ask you questions about your feelings about the different vaccines as opposed to the COVID vaccine. They never even ask any questions, just blanket denials. And, you know, be on your way. If you don't have the vaccine, you can prove that you had the vaccine by the 18th of October. You will be fired on the 19th. Another hospital is just putting them on unpaid leave for an indefinite period of time, saying that down the road we will review this case. So there's no opportunities for testing, for accommodation. My particular position could be easily accommodated in a remote role over the telephone. I could do most all of my work remotely. Even offered to do it remotely. They were offering other employees to come on board to cover for my department remotely who were vaccinated, but are not giving that opportunity to people like me who have been qualified in that position for many years. They're giving it to people from different departments who don't even have qualifications to do the job and sending us out to the street. So there you have it.
Yeah.
Jonathan, and I'd like to just make a comment right here before the next question. In case any of you are interested, every Saturday morning at 9:30, we have a time right here where anyone can come, share their story of what's going on with these mandates, and we pray. And let me tell you, you can feel quite alone in this world. I know there are many who are just being pressured, coerced, pulled, you know, especially in the medical field. You need camaraderie, you need community, you need to hear individuals who share testimonies of hope of how God is providing in their life as they've been going through this. So if you're facing vaccine mandates, you know individuals who are facing these sorts of mandates, you're discouraged, you don't know where to go, I'd like to encourage you and invite you to come at 9:30 every Saturday morning here in this space right here. We're going to continue to be praying for and sharing testimonies about mandates, how God is providing and asking for Him to provide a path for those who are struggling. Just wanted to add that in there. Okay, our next person at the microphone.
I'm a mother of 4 boys, ages 14 to 20. And I am wondering, because I have heard there are a lot of side effects from vaccines for boys in this age group. And I know other parents are struggling as well with sharing information with our kids because so much of it is censored. And I'm wondering, from a parent's perspective, how you would share this with kids with this age group, and if they were your kids, what would you say?
Well, there are, I guess it just depends on the child and what kind of information would speak to them. Some children are quite studious and don't mind reading things or looking at graphs and so forth. But a lot of kids, they just need maybe they don't quite have the attention span to handle more than, say, a 10 to 13 minute video. There are a lot of things you can find online, maybe not necessarily on YouTube, but on Rumble, some on YouTube too, where people share their stories. And I think personal stories really speak to a lot of people. It makes a powerful impact. You could share some of the numbers, like even from Dr. John Su's publication for the CDC, just looking at myocarditis. Open VAERS, OPENVAERS, those graphs are quite dramatic looking. You can share some of that. But yeah, I guess it would depend on the child.
Okay.
I do personally know of several young people who've gotten heart problems from the vaccine.
Okay.
I can share two stories. And I think that I think the moral of these stories is we need to really take care of our children's needs right now. One of them was a young man in Ukraine, wanted to go to college at one of our schools, actually. And his parents said, don't take the vaccine, no, whatever. But he really wanted to go. He went and got the vaccine. He was dead like 3 days later.
Wow.
And you can find the news report on that. There was a girl that was reported to me also at one of our schools, California. She asked for an exemption from the vaccine. She got the vaccine. They denied the exemption. I don't know what the grounds were. I don't know if it was medical or if it was religious, but whatever, the school denied it. So she went and got the first shot, was immediately admitted to the hospital with some kind of a heart condition, is being told she'll be taking heart medication for the rest of her life. The other thing too is these heart conditions, maybe Margaret can answer this because I have questions too. These heart conditions are usually seen in late in life, and then we get statistics that are kind of like, well, the average life after myocarditis is like 5 years is the average for mortality. I don't know if that would happen in a young person that got myocarditis, but whatever the case may be, this is the amazing thing about this story though, is the girl got that shot, and now she's had this problem. She goes back to the school this time with a medical excuse saying she doesn't want to take the second shot. The school denied the medical. And last I knew, she was contemplating whether to take the shot. That is how bad a young person wants to go to school or wants to just live their life and do their thing. And
it's
so
demonic.
It is demonic. And we've got to be extremely sensitive to that because it's tough to be a kid. It's really, really tough, and I think this is really, really tough times. I can see just this COVID thing is taking its toll mentally on me, and it's got to be worse for kids.
Thank you.
Do you think myocarditis in a young person will be as bad of a prognosis as it is in an older person?
Well, myocarditis in older people often is, the most common is still just plain old ischemic heart disease.
Right.
They've blocked off an artery and killed off parts of their heart, so they've got ischemic myocarditis. So very different prognosis versus viral myocarditis or some, other injury myocarditis. From what I've read, the majority of these young people have so-called recovered, but I don't know to what extent are they fully, if they were competitive swimmers, can they still competitively swim, or are they just recovered because they're able to go back to school? And,
Right.
I don't know.
Okay.
I work in the school environment, in elementary school, and I seen the kids having problems right now wearing the mask. How is the mask affecting the little kids from 12 to down? Because we have from kindergarten, actually from kindergarten to 5th grade in this school. And I seen they're crazy right now. And I seen all the stress on the teachers daily, okay? And I'm a custodian, I'm not even a teacher, so I'm not even working the day. I just cross with them like a couple hours. And the other question is, what is the unions are doing right now? What is the role they're playing right now? Because most of the medical educations, many places, the unions are supporting this. They're not supporting the employees. What is the role they're playing right now?
Let me address the mask issue,
Thank you.
and then maybe Mr. Zirkle can address your second question. So masking, another super contentious product of this pandemic. I have seen, and this hits a lot of employees much harder than some of the rest of us. I mean, I do wear a mask when I go into a room for a patient encounter. I try not to wear it too tight because personally I start to cough after a few minutes of wearing it. And then a lot of my older patients can't even understand what I'm saying to them because they partially depend on lip reading. And but I have seen workers in the hospital who work in COVID units who have to wear an N95 mask. These are very occlusive, come down with some serious problems. They're calling off sick every other week, missing 2 days of work every other week or so. We have, if we're worried about staffing shortages in hospitals, I think we're making the work of these people much harder by requiring them to wear these horrible things for 12-hour shifts. And the data on masking is not clear at best, Masks are droplet barriers. So, if you're speaking, inches away from someone's face, you can spray them with your spit. If you're operating over a open, surgical field, it's supposed to be sterile and you're talking during the surgery or you might sneeze. It makes sense to put a barrier over your mouth because the droplets are heavy and they'll fall. But in terms of stopping aerosolized virus, I think that the evidence just is not convincing. The World Health Organization put out a document 2020, early in 2020, and they updated it about every 6 months. It's called Advice on the Use of Masks in the Context of COVID-19. It's a PDF document. You actually have to go to the website, download the PDF. You can't view it any other way. And you have to read through this paper and look at the sections where they talk about the available evidence. And as far as masking healthy people in the community, their first document, when they first came out with this document, they said, frankly, there is no evidence that masking healthy persons in the community reduces spread of disease. Then later iterations of this paper later read, the evidence is limited and inconclusive. That was the word of the scientists putting this paper together at the WHO. And they do catalog kind of the tiers of evidence, starting with the randomized controlled trials. They looked at 10 randomized controlled trials on masking and spread of disease, just, random masking of everyone. And they found that 10 out of 10 showed no impact of masking, including the DanMask study, which was specifically on the spread of COVID with masking. Then they looked at observational studies, and they looked at some other smaller observational studies. And so putting all of this together, they said, the evidence is quite limited and inconclusive. In spite of this, the guidance committee recommends masking in the following settings, where social distancing is not possible, and so on and so forth. So the language, I think, is interesting. They did not say it is because of the overwhelming evidence that we recommend masking. They said in spite of. So putting the evidence aside, we recommend, because we're not sure, about some things, so I guess but they have another section where they talk about possible health consequences of masking. And the headaches are mentioned, worsening of respiratory conditions in people who already have respiratory conditions, acne. I looked at a study recently. They were measuring the dead space oxygen and carbon dioxide concentrations inside an N95 mask, and it fails OSHA ambient standards. And you're asking somebody to don this for 12 hours for a 12-hour shift. It's no wonder I'm getting patients coming in. This started last year, in fact, starting in March, I had patients coming in July and August saying, for the last 3 or 4 months, I am so depressed. Every day I come home from work, I cannot do anything. I can't do any housework. I'm angry at the kids. I just have to go to bed. Or asthmatics getting worse, headaches. My headache started back in March, this type of thing. Or people who are working with cleaning chemicals in the hospital, the chemicals actually get trapped behind the mask, and they're coming in with sore throats, having to rebreathe the air you just breathed out, and this is a moist, damp environment inside the mask. People are getting sinus infections, sore throats, and getting kind of more upper chest symptoms. And so I have written medical exemptions for masking. I don't do it just indiscriminately, but for people who come in where it's clearly their health problems are related to the mask. And I have seen every last one of them, if their employers were willing to accommodate them. I had one guy who thought he was dying. I think I have cancer. I have no energy. He's an electrician, and he was doing a lot of climbing and crawling and stuff. And I figured out, how do you feel when you're not at work? Oh, after a few days, I feel fine. That sort of thing. And so anyway, he saw me back in follow-up. He was great. We cured his cancer because his employer was willing to accommodate him and let him work without a mask. I have written for people to be allowed to wear face shields. And if you could take crazy glue and glue fabric on the lower border of your face shield and then just kind of tie it in the back so that at least you have openness on top. It's still a barrier, as good of a barrier as any cloth mask as far as things falling. But, your spit is not going to fall upward. So, that's an option. But it's a real problem, and I feel so sorry for these children. 2 years old and up being told to wear a mask. The WHO recommends not masking children under the age of 5, but we're kind of, I don't know. I'm not a parent. I feel for parents, especially, with kids of any age, but now with California also coming down with the vaccine mandate for children, that's scarier too. Do you want to address the union?
Unions are a mixed bag. There's a few unions, and the most notable one being postal workers, are saying, no, we're not going to do any of this stuff. But I think for the most part, the unions have been just like everybody else.
For the sake of our afternoon presentation, because we still are we have enough food downstairs and also have an afternoon presentation, and we don't want you all to spend such a late night that you all get COVID. If we can, Julie, if we can just have yours be the last question for this session. Not to say that the rest who are lined up don't have important questions. They do, but we do need to keep some sort of semblance of time. So Julie, you'll have the last question, and then we will we'll break. You can go downstairs for some light refreshments, and then back up here for Dr. Song's last presentation, which will include some practical demonstrations.
Thank you. Okay, so we all are talking about religious and medical exemptions. With the religious exemption, I'm wondering if you could clarify how we could get the ingredient list for these vaccines and an accurate account of what they are and what they do, because there is so much gray area. We know that it's a different technology, and it's not created by using a part of a pathogen, or whether live or dead. There is DNA altering, there is GMO issues, there are purported AI issues, aborted fetal tissue issues, and in the past they've used unclean meats for developing vaccines. So if I were to need to defend my faith, and I don't get the support from the organization, the head of our organization, how would I go about that without having that information? Because there's so much out there that needs to be clarified. I said loaded last question, I'm so sorry.
It's interesting you would ask that question, and I'm not sure that I truly know the answer. But I was looking at the FDA webpage. I think that they've posted it there somewhere. You're going to have to dig through hundreds of pages of documents probably to find it. But it's been redacted.
Oh.
And so, but there was a lawsuit that asked for it to be unredacted. And I just heard about this talked about briefly, and I don't know if this is really right. But supposedly there was a FOIA request, and it came back that the redacted ingredient was water. And now there's a lot of questions like, are you kidding me? You guys really redacted this out for water? Are you sure you just gave us what was really in it? And so what's going on with the some of us lawyers and some of us people that are kind of opposed to this whole thing, there has been one guy that's looked at the whole vaccines with an electron microscope, and he's seen some stuff, but we're not sure if he's credible or not. And so there's another researcher that's looking to getting an electron microscope to look at it. So that means, so I'm sort of answering the question this way. We don't know. And I'm not sure that you can trust the list. There's one other aspect about the list that we've been talking about as lawyers, and that is the part that was redacted. What was going on with that was the idea that it was redacted because it contained trade secrets. Well, water doesn't make any sense to be a trade secret. But what is the trade secret? There's a whistleblower out there who is saying, and she gives a pretty convincing presentation, that what is the trade secret is actually under contract from a Chinese manufacturer to make some kind of a graphene thing. That's why we talk about graphene a lot. So I don't think you're ever going to I don't think you're going to easily get to the bottom of this until someone starts looking at this thing, probably with electron microscopes, and we're probably going to have multiple people do it so that we're not, because we got to be sure that this isn't just some kind of a sensational clickbait kind of internet thing. We want to know that it's true or not. It's incredible times we're living in that we have to ask these questions. Who would think you'd have to ask these kinds of questions and have this kind of skepticism in America?
Thank you.
All right. Thank you for those great questions. Let's go ahead and take a break. I'm thinking it's 6:45 right now. Let's go ahead and come back at 7:15-ish. 30 minutes. 30 minutes is pretty good. 45 minutes?
No, whatever you like.
30 minutes, okay. Let's go ahead and take a break. Go ahead and you can go downstairs. We have food for everyone if you'd like to eat, and we'll be back up here. Oh, and let's pray together. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for your goodness and mercy and leading us during this session. Be with us and bless the food as we eat it downstairs. We ask in Christ's name, amen.
Amen.